Welcome, brothers and sisters from Westside. We are studying the patriarchs. We're in chapters 12 through 50. We've covered Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are now leaving. He is not, of course, going to die for several more years, but we enter a part of Genesis that is the longest section that's given to any one person, and that's to Joseph, who is, of course, the favorite son, the son of his old age of Jacob, and the tragic story that is between him and his brothers, and of course of Jacob's own dealings with them, and also, of course, that God intervenes and God's divine sovereignty is at work throughout the whole story. So it's a fascinating section of Scripture. It has always engaged even people that particularly are not drawn to follow God because it's simply a very good story and having all the parts that you would think would make up a great plot of betrayal and of how the tables are turned one day and that Joseph forgives and all the great things that come out of that. But you and I, of course, are interested in it because of the implications that come to us as we think about God and his purposes. Okay, so we're still dealing with the messy life of Jacob. And boy, if there's any indication of that in chapters 37 and 38, it's this story that begins with the selling of Joseph into Egyptian bondage. But before we get there, uh, we are summing up Esau's life in chapter 36. We're not going to spend much time here except to indicate to you where Edom is and who all of this is. It begins by saying these are the generations of Esau, and it says that is Edom. So if you notice on the map at the very bottom in the yellow, there's the kingdom of Edom. This is, of course, much later map when Judah and Israel have divided. So that comes way after King David. Uh, uh, well, way after 40 something years after the rule of Solomon, but nonetheless, later time period. But the kingdom of Edom would be roughly in those days that size, probably smaller during the time that we'll consider with Exodus and all that. It would have grown over time. They will make a lot of their money by raids as you get out of the blessing that Jacob gives to Esau, if you can call it a blessing that he'll live by his sword, but also that they controlled the king's highway. The king's highway would come down out of Damascus through Ammon, Rabbi Ammon, and then down through the kingdom of Moab, and then it would turn, and Petra would be one of the places that would guard that. And of course, they got tolls. They charge people for coming through their country. So this is where Esau will pull his family off to. Now, the Bible sums up Esau's lineage because he was blessed by Jacob too. He's one of Jacob's sons. So there is a blessing. As I said, though, you can call it that. And the rest of Scripture will often give that relationship that existed between Edom, the people of Esau, and the people of Jacob, whose now name is Israel, that God had changed it to. So those will be the nations' names, and that it will often indicate that they were brothers. And you have some passages there on the screen that you can look up and see how the Bible refers to God, uh, those people as being brothers. Now, they were at war many times, and of course, the older will serve the younger, and so we will see that the nation of Edom will often be in subjection to either King David or to Judah later in the divided kingdom. So there's a lot of names in here that we're not going to spend time or think about it, but we need to address some issues. First of all, the wives of Esau in chapter 36 and verse 2, and I'll let you read that verse, are not the same as the earlier ones. When you look back at the names of the ones that are in chapter 26, remember that he married two Hittite women, and one of the women here is even called a Hivite. So the names aren't the same. The one that is Ishmael is has some similarities. The names aren't the same, but it is their brother was the same name. So again, he had married her in chapter 28 and verse 9. Now, the reason for that may be very simple. It could be that the list suffered transmission errors. The name sometimes, if you were to look at Hebrew, just the slightest little mark, like we would call an apostrophe, can change the whole spelling of a word. So those things could have dropped out, somewhat changed, and that's one possibility. They could have been nicknames. Obviously, in this chapter, several times it says Esau was Edom, or vice versa, and we know why his name was Edom. Remember, I asked you that question in the questions, and that was when he sold his birthright to Jacob, and Jacob was making what was just called some red, and we call it a stew. And so you can think of chili, something like that. It has that sort of color, and it was called red. And because Esau sold his birthright on that occasion, then his name was nicknamed to Edom. How bad that was to sum up a person that would do that, sell his birthright because he thought he was going to starve to death. And we dealt with that passage back then, but that becomes his nickname. So could these also be nicknames, other names that these women went by? Since we know, for instance, the Ishmaelite had the same brother. And it could be that the first wives die and that these are later otherwise. We see that many times. So there's a lot of possible explanations. A lot of times, people that object to the Bible and say, oh, it's full of contradictions. I mean, this is one of the places they'll go to. But if you can give plausible reasons for why things exist, then you can show from other passages that these kinds of things happen, and they really don't have a case for their objection to the scriptures. All right, as we said to you, Esau's descendants are called Edomites, and that's found again down in verses 29 and 30. It says, these are the chiefs of, and it mentions all of them, and mentions that these are the kings who reign in the land of Edom. In the chapter we're reading from, but if you go back to chapter 25, that's where the story we told a minute ago. Esau relocates to Seir, and Seir would be the mountainous uh, fortress, and we'll show some pictures in a minute to show you how impregnable was Edom, the country of Edom, which later will be controlled by the Nabattu tribes. You see that out to the right of the kingdom of Edom on the map, and the Nabateans will come to rule in that area later. But Edom, as you know, plays all the way into the New Testament. The province that was called Edomia is just another transliteration or spelling of Edom. And these are where the Herods come from. So the Herods that finally rule over Judah are really the descendants of Esau. So they've all stayed in that area, as we would know from Bible history. So in chapter 6, it says, chapter 36, verse 6, it says that Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, all the members of his house, all that he had acquired. He went into the land away from, in the land of Canaan. He went into a land away from his brother Jacob, for their possessions were too great for them to dwell together. And so, as one man has said, the birthright and the blessing are come to Jacob, and Esau is just conceding that. And he is moving away from his brother Jacob into that area. So, what I want to show you now is some pictures of Petra to show you how formidable were the defenses and why the Edomites thought they could not be cast down. So here's the modern layout of the countries that are in that area. The modern country of Jordan is where Petra is now. So if you think of the southwest area of the country of Jordan, Amman is still that ancient city that was also the Ammonites. So that's where that still descends from. But Petra is what we're going to be looking at. See the modern country of Israel above it, and it extends all the way down to that Gulf of Aqaba. When you see this city there, Aqaba, and it was called that in ancient times too. That's part of the Red Sea. And so you see the Palestine area that's called the West Bank, where so much of the troubles in modern time occurred. But that's what it would look like today. Now, what I want to show you is what the impregnable fortress of the Edomites would have looked like. The way into the area that has a deep basin, and it has a lot of area where people could gather, is through a narrow seek. And you can see people on the right hand picture entering it today. You go to a visitor center and then you walk for several miles to get into, or a few miles to get into the basin area where the people would have assembled. But you can imagine that an army could not, I mean, you would have to enter that seek about 2 or 3 wide at a time, maybe. At other places, maybe 1, 2 people. So with some well-placed archers and some barriers, it would almost be virtually impossible for an army to storm. And if they collected water, which in the rainy season they would have plenty of cisterns to do that, they could last an army out for years and not just months. So when you come to the basin area, what you see on the left side is what's called the treasury. Now, this comes later. The Nabateans that follow the Edomites are the ones who carve these things straight out of the rock, and they are impressive. It's one of the great wonders of the ancient world. And one of the places that if you ever go visit that area of the world, you'll obviously want to go to. Petra's Sikh in 1947 on the left is compared to the same location in 2013. So you can see it's been cleaned up, obviously for tourism and all of the things that can help those economies in that area. All right, this is a map of the Sikh. I've circled it in red there. That's what that narrow chasm is called. And you can see how far from the Welcome Center you have to walk. You see down to the left of the red circle the treasury. That's the picture that we had just a brief glimpse of through the Sikh entrance, and then see the lighter color, the darker color of the mountains, the tall mountains that surround. The lighter color is a basin. That is a flat, mostly flat area where you could build. And man, the building goes on into the Byzantine times. So the Romans and that came before the Byzantines, and all of that has people building stuff in there as they conquered the peoples that were there. And so this is a view of the general Petra Basin. You can imagine how formidable it would be for an army to try to scale any of that kind of thing. They could easily be picked off by archers that were well placed, and all kinds of defenses could be put in. Later, the minor prophet Obadiah will prophesy. He just has the one chapter, as you know, it's a single chapter. And so at verses 3 and 4, he says to Edom, "The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord." And so what we know about God is there is no impregnable fortress to him. There's no nuclear arms that we can master, no great fleets that we can put on the ocean, that God could not bring the United States down if he wants to, or any other nation on the face of the earth. And Edom would pass into the ash heap of history, because God said, "You thought you couldn't be brought down in your arrogance and how you dealt with my people, but I will bring you down from there. Even if you set your nest into the very stars of the heaven, I would bring you down." So as you enter that basin area, there's the treasury. They don't know exactly what it was used for. It could have been a tomb at one time, but an impressive piece. You can tell just being carved out of the face of that rock is some impressive work that was done by the Nabateans. I love the top left-hand picture because it shows you the depth. Shows you part of this kind of seeks that has to be walked in to enter other basins once you're inside that area. And then the bottom left hand corner is just another carving. There are so many of these that are in that area. Here are the royal tombs in Petra. So as you've followed that map earlier, you would come around to where they are. But you can see how wide and spacious the area is, but surrounded by all of these granite mountains. Again, here's another view in modern times of tourists and the tombs or other buildings that were carved out. All right, so we come to chapter 37, which we'll leave 36 then to you to look at and read all those wonderful names and think about that. But God is just obviously dealing with Esau as being a descendant of Jacob, and closing out that chapter or that part with him. All right, in chapter 37, then we begin the Joseph story. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojourning, the land of Canaan, and these are the generations of Jacob. Remember, that's how all the great sections begin. It will either say, something like that. This is the beginning of the generations of Isaac. But now it's Jacob, but Jacob's through Joseph, because he takes up from chapter 37 through 50, the longest section given to any one person. And Joseph was 17 years old and was pasturing his flock with his brothers, and he was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wife. And Joseph brought a bad report All right, so boy there means that since he's younger, he was serving sort of as their helper, but you sort of get the idea that he's a tattletale a little bit, and that's going to play into the story. That's going to wreak havoc in Joseph's life, and in the end, of course, will be a blessing to God's people in that time, that small band of Jacob's descendants. But it does carry the idea, boy, of a servant. So he brings a bad report of the sons of the handmaids. And what this term, I'm told by others that, and I've just given you what they said, it refers to defamation or whispered slander. In other words, it may not have been entirely true, or that he maligned them. Or as one man said, it was new, maybe it was wrong things they were doing, but it was news definitely slanted to damage the sons of Bilhah. So you can imagine that the way Jacob put Joseph up on a pedestal, as we'll see with the coat of a robe of many colors, and that he treated him with a special way that he did not treat the other brothers. You can imagine that that would have gone to the head of Joseph, and I think we see some of that. In Numbers 13:32, by the way, the bad report thing is the same thing that the 10 spies that give a bad report of the land when they come back. And so we going on at verse 3, the very first part, it says, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. And so Jacob is setting up a disaster for his home. He is favoriting one son, fostering a prideful attitude, maybe in Joseph, for which the whole family is going to pay the price. And we are told that he makes him a coat or a robe of many colors. Now, hard to translate. You'll note that the footnote of the English Standard says a robe with long sleeves. And so not only a robe, but sleeve, that came down to the wrist, but all the way down to the ground. And so it wasn't, as one man said, a garment for work, but it was the garment for an overseer. So you can imagine that if that is the correct understanding of it, how much more that would cause the other brothers who are older than him by several years and are angry at him. The other time you see that word used in 2 Samuel 13:18, where it says that David clothed the daughters, and Tamar there, that story of Amnon taking her and forcing her. But Tamar and all the daughters wore these kind of robes, and there it's translated too by a long sleeved robe, or maybe a robe of many colors, but there's no way of knowing exactly. Mesopotamian archaeology, there has been a lot of artwork that has been found, and it shows people that are in this capacity wearing those long sleeve robes and robes down to the ground. So, again, that's the area that Jacob is from and where he's grown up, basically, by being there 20 years in Haran. He would have been greatly influenced by their culture, just as all of us are influenced by our cultures. All right, so verse 4 says that his brothers saw that their father loved him more. So the envy, the jealousy, and the hatred that is about to be unleashed in that family. They hated him, the second half of verse 4 says, and could not speak peacefully to him. Shalom would have been the greeting that anyone would have given to one another in that day, and they cannot even give their own brother that greeting. And so at verse 5, we come to the famous first of Joseph's dreams. That's how God is going to speak to Joseph, and not only here, but in other occasions, and even people that dream dreams he'll be able to interpret. But this particular case is Joseph himself dreaming two dreams. Now it says that Joseph had a dream. And I want us to emphasize here that the outcome of all the rest of the chapters, 37 through 50, is not Joseph the hero. It has nothing to do with Joseph, but with divine sovereignty, with God controlling it from the beginning to the end and orchestrating and playing when people thought they were doing it, and they were doing it of their own free will. I'm not saying that. I'm not being Calvinist, that they had no free will. They are doing it of their free will, but God overrides that. God orchestrates it. God provides providence, as we say. And so it is the great story that occurs throughout the rest of the Joseph story. So he dreams two dreams. The first of them is recorded to us at verses 5 through 8, and it's about Joseph said, and I'll come to this in a minute, but he says, behold, and he says it several times. You can imagine if a boy got a dream like this. And remember that dreams have happened before. God has come to Jacob in a dream. Remember the ladder up to the heavens at Bethel? And so even though we're going to see Jacob, his father, rebuke him later on, it will also say that Jacob kept this in mind. He pondered on it because he knew that God revealed by dreams. And it was widely believed, not only in among God's people, but obviously in all the areas, as we'll find even in Egypt, that dreams were a way that the gods, or the true God, as we know in the Bible, spoke to people. And so what he dreams in there, as the picture is trying to depict, is that the sheaves represent Joseph's sheaf and then all the 11 brothers' sheaves, but they bow down. The sheaves bowed down to his sheaf. So you can think of binding grain. You see a standing field of grain behind Joseph, or the depiction of him there, and the sheaves of his brothers bowing to them. So you can imagine the anger they had toward him, that he would dare to even tell them this dream. Now, it's interesting to me why what was he thinking? First of all, I think he's the favorite of Jacob, and therefore could he think of himself as being untouchable and all the pride and everything, and he wears, as that certain depiction shows, a robe of several colors. Was he just naive because he was 17 and he wasn't realizing the extent of his brother's hatred for him? Or it may have been that he was just so excited because 3 times he says, behold, behold. I mean, to receive something like this, and he wasn't even thinking about what the reaction would be. All right, so the second dream is that he tells them is the sun and the moon and the 11 stars. So obviously the 11 brothers all bowed down to him. And at that point, his father even rebukes him. It says, and when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers and he come down to you to bow ourselves to the ground before you? Remember that you would bow your face to the ground before someone. And those that have studied the word in their commentaries say that the rebuke here, I don't know if Jacob was screaming at him, but I want you to understand that it's not a silent rebuke. Rebuke always kind of carries a really harsh tone. It's a sharp tone. But it does say that Jacob kept this in his mind. And again, as we're going to find out later, when you double a dream, remember what's going to happen with Pharaoh? Remember what happens with the butler and the baker, each of them dreaming a dream, but once again, 2 dreams, that it means that it's certain to happen. What's going to happen, God has revealed. Remember, that's what Joseph will later say to Pharaoh. He's going to bring it to pass, and there's no way that it's not going to happen. So these dreams set up a scenario that's going to lead to, obviously, Joseph being sold into slavery. So what we come to then is that Jacob, the sons of Jacob are pasturing their father's flock. Verse 12 says at Shechem. That's interesting to me. Remember what happened at Shechem? Remember that Jacob was fearful that the peoples around there would come and attack him and he would be destroyed. But God put a terror from God upon them, and they did not pursue him. Is that terror still in hold? That city was stripped of everybody. The men were all killed, their bodies all left, and the women and everything else is taken. So, I mean, you can imagine when others came to find out what had happened, but that's where they go nonetheless. It's about 50 miles. If you look at the map there at Hebron, remember that's Hebron where Isaac had been, where he had buried Isaac. And it's about 50 miles up to Shechem. And then we find out through the story that Jacob tells Joseph, go and find out what's happening to your brothers. And I think about the fact that he doesn't even think, Jacob's not even thinking about what danger he's putting his son Joseph in. He's not thinking that his sons could even do something capable even of thinking about killing him. So they had moved on to Dothan, and Joseph finds that out from a man in that area. So Dothan is about 15 miles from there. And if you'll think about sometimes how many names of places in America bear their place name in the Bible. I can think of Dothan, Alabama. I almost moved there one time to preach the gospel in southern Alabama. So there's a lot of times you'll see that in Bible names being taken by people that used to know the book and named those places after the Bible, obviously. So Joseph found them at Dothan, and when they see him coming, they said, "Here comes this dreamer." And so let's kill him. That's their first plot. And then we'll see what will become of his dream. So, man, that's what's motivating them. I mean, what's driving them is that hatred that has just been exacerbated by the dreams that Joseph revealed to them. And so when he comes to them, they strip him of the robe. So that robe that had been the difference between them and how Jacob viewed the other brothers and Joseph, they strip him of that robe and they throw him into a pit. Now, later, I want you to note how often the word pit is going to occur in Joseph's life, because it's going to be exactly the way the prison that he's thrown into is described and where Simeon later is put. It's interesting how that plays into the story later as we're going down and thinking of it. And then think of the callousness of these guys. When they get done throwing him to a pit, later they will say, "We did not listen to his pitiful cries to us to release him." Reuben tries to come to make them come to their senses. And Reuben is the one that says, "Let's don't kill him." That's why they throw him into the pit. And the whole reason for that is Reuben thought that he could come later and free Joseph and restore him to his father. And it makes you wonder if Reuben, remember, he's the eldest, and that he had slept with Bilhah, one of Jacob's handmaids, one of his wives, secondary wives, concubines, in chapter 35, verse 22. So is this a way that Reuben could get back into the good graces of his father, that he could tell them what happened and never send Joseph out of his sight to deal with his brothers? But for some reason, Reuben goes away from the rest of them, the rest of the 10, and it will be Judah that will take over after they sit down to eat. But what is fascinating to me about that is Walkie said their next meal in Joseph's presence will be with Joseph at the head of the table. That will come much later when he is ruler or tantamount to ruler in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. And it will be Joseph that has all power at the head of the table. And it is kind of fascinating to think about that. All right, so Judah said to his brothers, and Judah takes the lead here. Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, because they see a band of Ishmaelites. You'll note in the text that they're also called Midianites, and we're not for sure quite if other Midianites may have been separate from the Ishmaelites, or they might have uh, dwelt in the same area and therefore began to intermingle and be called by this. The names were interchangeable at the later time when Moses is writing, because they're going to be called Ishmaelites one time, Midianites another time. And we know that they're from different clans. Ishmael, remember, a descendant of Abraham. Midian is from a different line. But nonetheless, there are good explanations for that. Again, people think sometimes they have contradictions, but you can look up that kind of thing for yourself. But what the brothers do is clearly later in the Mosaic Law and in ancient Near Eastern text of the time is a capital offense. Now that's why it's going to play so much into the story later on when his brothers are fearful of him, that he will now deal with us after Jacob dies. Remember that touching story where Joseph forgives them all over again and embraces them, says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." It was a capital offense, and they would have known that. All right. So how are they going to convince Jacob? What now? The disappearance of Joseph. They sell him for 20 shekels of silver, and he's carried away by the Ishmaelites as they are going down to trade into Egypt. Remember that Palestine is a land bridge, and so as you can see that red line from Dothan all the way down into Egypt, that God positioned His people well. They were in a land area where lots of trade would come from the northern part of Mesopotamia, would have to pass through Palestine, or on the other side, the King's Highway that would come through Ammon, and down through Edom, but nonetheless, many times crossed over and passed through Palestine. That God had put His people in a good place to spread His word, to be a link to God when people had forgotten Him. All right, so back to the story. How they going to convince Jacob of Joseph's disappearance? They take the coat of many colors, or the long sleeved robe, and they slaughter a goat and they dip it in the blood. And then they come and they present it to Jacob and say, "Is this your son Joseph? We found this. Is this your son Joseph's robe? And I think of the irony here that Jacob deceived Isaac with a slaughtered goat, and now Jacob's sons deceived their father by the same means. Back in chapter 27, verse 9 and 15. Again, as Jacob had been deceived by Laban and woke up and it was Leah, now for the next 22 years, he's going to think that his son Joseph, his beloved and most favorite son, has died at the hands of a wild beast, and he is convinced that the blood on the garment. And so he enters into a time of great mourning. He tore his garments, which would have been the way they would express, and put on sackcloth, rough goat hair on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. Remember that mourning there is not like we do. We have about a 1-2 day funeral, and that's it. We all go back to our lives. But they would mourn sometimes for as many as 30 and 60 days. And we'll see that even later in the story of how Jacob is buried. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol." And that is the place where the spirits of men go, to my son mourning, the grave. Thus his father wept for him. And then the text simply says to us that meanwhile, Joseph was sold into Egypt. The Midianites here, instead of Ishmaelites, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar. And again, another explanation for that is there could have been Midianites, Ishmaelites, both traveling together. And I don't know if I said that a minute ago, and that may be one of the explanations. Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. That's going to play into this because that's the guy that is the bodyguard to Pharaoh and also controls the prison. Those that offend Pharaoh, then this man would have that high office. And so somewhere in that red circle, in that area that generally was occupied for the most by the Egyptians, that's where he is sold into ancient Egypt. And so our text will come back on Friday, and we'll look at chapters 39 and 40 and conclude this week. So thank you very much for listening.